Cold case that baffled investigators for 34 years has finally been solved. The murder of 4 teenage girls at a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas.
And the man identified as the killer has now been linked to crimes, including murder in at least 5 states.
He feels what we are feeling right now, because I tell you something, he is going to pay for what he did to my friends and to the rest of them, because that's not right.
The fire was set to erase everything, every fingerprint, every fiber, every trace of the man who slipped out the back of a yogurt shop just before midnight. It almost worked. The flames took the whole room, but they never reached what a 13-year-old had already taken from him. Her name was Amy Ayers, a cowgirl, an old soul, there for one reason, a ride home. In her last minutes, she fought back hard enough to take something of her killer with her and held on to it. That single trace would wait 34 years to say his name, and by the time it could, the wrong men were already behind bars. It starts on West Anderson Lane on a Friday that looked like any other. 4 girls, 1 small shop, and a killer who set a fire to make sure no one could ever name him. But here's what he didn't know. The technology that would one day name him from what he left behind hadn't been invented yet. The evidence, though, already existed. It just had to survive long enough for the world to catch up to it. The shop was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, the kind of bright first job a teenager is proud of. Jennifer Harbison, 17, worked the closing shift, and her little sister Sarah, 15, had come by just to keep her company. Eliza Thomas, also 17, was closing up beside her, and Amy Ayers, 13, a cowgirl who'd rather smell like a barn than a mall, had only stopped in for a ride home. 4 girls, 1 ordinary night, and the youngest was about to do something that would outlive them all. Closing time was almost gentle. They wiped the machines, stacked the chairs, count the drawer. Therefore, nothing about that night should have ended the way it did. But someone came in behind them, and whoever it was didn't just want 4 girls silenced, they wanted the room itself erased. Therefore, they set a fire, not in a rage, but with a killer's cold precision. Flames meant to swallow the fingerprints, the fibers, every thread that could ever point back to a name. Here's what makes this case almost unbearable. The fire nearly worked. It took the walls, the evidence, the timeline, almost everything a detective would ever need. But it could not reach what the youngest girl had already taken. In the last moments she had, 13-year-old Amy Ayers fought, and something of the man who did this stayed beneath her fingernails, held there, protected, safe from the flames that consumed everything else in that room. She was 13, and without knowing it, she had just saved the only piece of evidence that would ever matter. This is Last Seen USA, where we reopen the missing and the murdered, the cases the headlines dropped, and the families who never could. By the end of this one, you'll know the single piece of evidence investigators walked past for 34 years, and the name it was hiding the whole time. But knowing something survived and being able to read it are 2 very different things. What she left behind would wait 34 years for the technology to catch up. And by the time it could, the city had already convicted the wrong men. 2 things came through that fire intact, and together, they are the entire reason this case could ever be solved. The first, you already know, stayed beneath Amy's fingernails, the hands of a girl more used to reins and rope than anything in a shopping center. But in 1991, that was almost a cruel joke, because the science to read what she'd saved simply did not exist yet. Therefore, the smartest thing anyone did in those first days wasn't a breakthrough at all. It was restraint. Rather than spend the fragile trace she left behind on the crude tests of the era, they sealed it away, untouched, protected, waiting for a future no one could promise would ever arrive. Now picture what the investigators walked into. A space burned down to black, walls scorched, everything the fire could reach turned to ruin. This wasn't a crime scene that got destroyed by accident. It was engineered to give them nothing. And for a while, That's exactly what it gave, until someone looked down. But fire has a weakness. It rises. It climbs toward the ceiling and leaves the low places alone. And in that floor, there was a drain. Down inside it, past where the flames had burned and the firefighters' water had carried the rest away, a single spent shell casing had come to rest. A .380, the signature of the gun used that night, waiting in the one small pocket of that room the fire was never going to reach. Therefore, without realizing it yet, investigators were holding two signatures of the same man, the biology beneath Amy's nails and the ballistics down that drain. Two survivors, two witnesses who could not speak, not yet. And that mattered more than any forensic detail, because that same night, in homes across Austin, 4 sets of parents were still waiting up, listening for a car in the driveway, a key in the lock, the ordinary sounds of daughters coming home. Those 2 silent things in the ash were the only promise those families had that the truth might still be found. But here is the detail that should stop you cold. Whoever did this slipped out the back of that shop into the dark, carrying a small handgun, a .380. And within 48 hours, hundreds of miles away, the people hunting this case would hold a .380, the same caliber used that night, in their own hands, and let it go. But no one made that connection. Not that week. Not for the next 3 decades. 500 miles away, in the West Texas desert, a man was already driving toward a checkpoint with the answer in his glove box, and no one would ask the right question for 34 years. So why did no one ask the right question for 34 years? It wasn't because Austin had no answers. It was because the city had far too many. This crime tore something open in Austin. 4 girls gone on an ordinary Friday, inside a bright little shop a family might walk past any day of the week, and suddenly no one felt safe. Therefore, the pressure on police to name someone, anyone, became almost unbearable. And when a city needs an answer that badly, answers start to appear. They appeared for years. Before it was over, more than 50 different people would sit down across a table and claim this crime as their own. But that number isn't a breakthrough. It's a warning sign. 50 confessions to something one man did is not a surplus of truth. It's a flood of noise. Therefore, the hardest job here wasn't finding a suspect. It was staying upright in the current of them. One name rose above the rest. Kenneth McDuff, a genuinely notorious Texas killer, out walking free in exactly this window and taking lives again. On paper, he was terrifyingly plausible. But when investigators held him up against the 2 things the fire couldn't erase, he did not fit. That door closed. Then, in 1992, 2 men gave detailed confessions, and for a moment it looked finished. But their story cracked against the evidence. Details wrong in ways only the real killer could have gotten right. Another answer dissolved in front of them, and each time one collapsed, the same question rose out of the ash. Then who? Through all of it, one investigator kept doing the least glamorous thing in the building. His name was John Jones, and while the confessions poured in, he kept walking back to the only 2 witnesses that could never lie: the trace beneath Amy's fingernails and the casing down that drain. And he asked the same 3 things of every lead that came through the door. Show me the evidence. Show me the weapon. Show me the DNA. Every confession that couldn't answer those 3, he refused to build a case on. And that refusal would eventually cost him his place on this very investigation. He had every reason to want it over. 2 of the girls, Jennifer and Sarah, were sisters who spent their last evening in the same room, and their mother, along with 3 other families, was waiting on him for something to hold on to. But Jones understood a truth the city didn't want to hear. The wrong answer wouldn't heal any of them. It would only ruin more lives that had nothing to do with it. So he held the line. He set aside the confessions that couldn't be proven, including 4 names in particular. Years later, a new detective would pick those exact 4 names back up, and this time, no one would stop him. By the late 1990s, the case had gone quiet. But quiet is not the same as solved. Therefore, when the file cracked open again, a new team went looking for something the original detectives never had. A story clean enough to carry to a jury. And they built it around 4 names: Maurice Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn. Young men now, but boys back when the shop burned. One of them, Pierce, just 16 years old, on the night 4 families stopped sleeping. And Pierce had crossed police radar before. Weeks after the murders, back in 1991, a teenager had been stopped at an Austin mall carrying a pistol, a .22, the same caliber as one of the 2 guns used that night. Sit with that for a second. A boy, a matching caliber, in the right city, at the right time. If you were the detective staring at that, wouldn't you feel your pulse jump? Wouldn't you think, this is him? But a feeling in your gut isn't evidence in a courtroom, because when that pistol was finally measured against the crime, the ballistics could never tie it to the shop. The gun that felt like an answer wasn't one. Therefore, for years, those 4 names sat exactly where Jones had left them, set aside, unproven, until the reopened case brought them into small rooms, one at a time, for interviews that stretched on hour after hour, much of it with no camera running to show us what was said or how. And out of those hours came confessions. Here is the part that should stop you cold. When you lay those confessions side by side, they don't agree with each other. They contradict on who did what, on where people stood, on when things happened. The kind of details the real killer could never get wrong. And yet, given enough hours in that room, each young man's account still curled back around and pointed at himself. That is how you get 50 confessions to one crime. It isn't 50 guilty people. It's a machine. Enough pressure, enough exhaustion, enough leading questions, and a frightened person will hand you the story you're reaching for. One of the detectives tied to these statements had already been linked to another Texas case, where an innocent man confessed to something he did not do. Therefore, a confession, on its own, proves only one thing: that someone in that room wanted it badly enough. And every hour spent breaking the wrong young men was another hour the man who actually did this stayed free. A jury would believe them anyway. And the one piece of evidence that could have stopped all of it was sitting quietly in a lab, pointing at a man who had never been in that room. 2 of those 4 young men, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, didn't just get accused, they got convicted. But the story of how is the part that should make your jaw tighten. Because by the time these cases went before a jury, testing had already found a man's genetic profile in the evidence the fire never reached, and it matched none of them. Not Springsteen, not Scott, not Pierce, not Wellborn. Rather than let that stop everything, the theory simply grew a new branch. Maybe, prosecutors suggested, there had been a 5th person that night, a phantom who left his DNA behind and then vanished from every single confession. Therefore, the juries were asked to look past the one witness that could not lie and to trust statements that couldn't even agree with each other. And they did sit with that. The genetic evidence pointed away from these men, and they were convicted anyway. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to die. Michael Scott was sent away for the rest of his life. Therefore, 2 young men, who had been teenagers themselves when the shop burned, began losing years to a crime the physical evidence said they did not commit. Springsteen's death sentence would later be lifted because the courts recognized he'd been too young, still a minor, when the murders happened. But a life spared inside a prison you don't belong in is not the same thing as freedom. Then the ground shifted. Higher courts looked hard at how those confessions had been used and ruled the trials fundamentally unfair. The convictions came apart, one in 2006, the next in 2008. And in the summer of 2009, Springsteen and Scott walked out into daylight for the first time in years. But walking out is not the same as being cleared. The doors opened, yet the word guilty still hung in the air behind them, uncrossed, because no one had officially said the other word: innocent. So sit in what this actually cost. Nearly a decade of 2 men's lives, gone. 4 girls, Amy, Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, still without the truth their families had been promised. And somewhere out there, untouched by any of it, the real man went about his life, while a city told itself the case was closed. This is the low point of the story. The moment where it would be easy to believe no one is ever coming. But remember what a 13-year-old had been holding this entire time. So if the DNA belonged to none of them, whose was it? The answer, it turned out, had already been lying in a grave for a decade. If you're still with me after everything this case has taken, then you're exactly the kind of person these 4 girls needed, because this is the chapter where the ground finally moves. You're still here, and that's the whole point. Cases like this only stay alive because people like you refuse to look away. So subscribe and help us keep bringing them back. In 2022, a detective named Daniel Jackson picked the file back up, but he didn't start with the confessions. He started with the 2 witnesses that never once stopped telling the truth, the trace beneath Amy's fingernails and the single casing from the drain. And now, both could finally speak, because the technology Amy's evidence had waited 34 years for had arrived. He ran that .380 casing through a modern ballistics network, and it didn't just sit there, it lit up. The same gun had been fired in another crime, hundreds of miles away, in Lexington, Kentucky, in 1998. A weapon from an Austin yogurt shop, alive again in a second state, 7 years later. Then the trace under Amy's nails did the same thing. Using genetic genealogy, the family tree science that has cracked so many cold cases, investigators followed her evidence across the country to a 1990 murder in Greenville, South Carolina. A woman named Genevieve Zitricki, the one her family called Jenny. 2 crimes, 2 states, 1 man's shadow across both. And when those 2 roads, the gun and the genes, finally met, they pointed at a single person. His name was Robert Eugene Brashers, a drifter, a man with no roots in Austin and no reason on earth to be in that shop. Not a local, not one of the 50 who confessed, a ghost the city had never once looked at, and, it would turn out, a man whose trail of harm ran through several states. But here is where you need to go back. Remember the man driving toward a checkpoint in the West Texas desert 2 days after the murders. You've already met him. On December 8, 1991, about 48 hours after the fire, Robert Brashers was stopped at a highway checkpoint, driving a truck stolen from Georgia, carrying a .380. The man who did this passed through law enforcement's hands within 2 days of the crime. And the gun? It was handed back to his family and used again. The answer wasn't hiding in another country. It rolled up to a checkpoint 48 hours in and drove away. Therefore, the questions opening now are almost harder than the ones we began with. Why was a man like this in Austin at all? And if his gun surfaced in Kentucky and his DNA in South Carolina, how many others are out there whose names we still don't know? 2 lines of evidence had finally found him, but the case still needed the one witness who had been waiting 34 years to speak, and she was 13 years old. So how does a 13-year-old testify 34 years after she's gone? You let her evidence speak, but first, you need the one man who could answer it, the killer himself. To be certain, investigators needed Robert Brashers' own DNA to set against the trace beneath Amy's fingernails. But Brashers had been dead since 1999, having taken his own life as police closed in on him for other crimes. Therefore, the only way left to question him was to bring him back. In 2018, investigators opened his grave in Arkansas, so the man himself could finally answer for that night. And when his profile was set beside what Amy had held under her fingernails, there was no ambiguity left. It was him, not a maybe, not a phantom 5th man invented for a jury, the exact person she had fought in the last minutes of her life, named at last by the evidence she'd refused to let go of. So sit with what that means. A 13-year-old girl, a cowgirl who'd rather have been near horses than anywhere on earth, spent the final moments she had reaching out and taking hold of the one thing that could name the man who did this. And she held on. Through fire, through courtrooms, through the wrong men in the wrong cells, she never let go. Amy Ayers solved her own murder. And the detective who'd been pushed aside for asking the unglamorous questions, John Jones, was right. Every confession he had refused to build a case on turned out to be exactly the noise he feared. The two witnesses he never stopped trusting, the trace under Amy's nails, the casing in the drain, were the only ones that ever told the truth. Therefore, a man who had carried this weight for the better part of his life could finally set some of it down. And in the fall of 2025, in a room that had heard 34 years of wrong answers, Austin police stood up and said the right one out loud. Robert Eugene Brashers.
After 34 years, the Austin police have made a significant breakthrough in this case. This is one of the most devastating and haunting cases in this city's history. For the families of Amy, Eliza, Sarah, and Jennifer, today marks a critical step forward in honoring not only their memory, but getting at truth and accountability. We now have evidence linking a specific individual to this case, Robert Eugene Brashers. The only physical evidence located at that scene has been matched to him. Brashers died by suicide in 1999 after a standoff with police in Missouri. And his DNA has since been, and before this connection, he has been connected to murders and rapes across the country.
For the parents who had waited up that first night, listening for cars that never turned into the driveway, a name could not bring their daughters home. But it ended the not knowing. It closed a question that had stayed open longer than some of those girls had been alive. But being right and being finished are not the same thing, because the man they finally named left behind questions that no lab, no grave, and no press conference can ever close. Start with the part that took the longest. In early 2026, decades after 4 families were first promised the truth, a court finally said the word that daylight in 2009 never did. Innocent. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn were not just released anymore. They were cleared on the record for good. Therefore, the case the city had built against them finally came apart completely. For men who had spent nearly a decade behind bars, and then years more with the word guilty still whispering behind their names, that one official word changed everything. It couldn't hand the lost years back, but it let them stop being suspects in the eyes of strangers and start being what they'd been all along, innocent people who happened to be standing where a city needed someone to blame. But justice that arrives this late never arrives whole, because Maurice Pierce never got to hear it. He had died years earlier, in 2010, long before anyone stood up and admitted he'd been telling the truth from the start. So when a settlement finally came, and the city acknowledged what it had cost these men, Pierce's share went to the wife and daughter he left behind, Kimberly and Marisa, carrying his name where he no longer could. And even now, with a name, a grave, and a confession written in DNA, the hardest questions just sit there, unanswered. Why was Robert Brashers in Austin at all? He had no family there, no history, no reason. And here is the thought that should stay with you. His gun surfaced in Kentucky. His DNA surfaced in South Carolina. His trail crossed state after state. So how many other families are still waiting for the name that Amy, at last, delivered? Sit with the whole shape of it. Detectives missed him at a checkpoint 48 hours in. Prosecutors built a case on confessions instead of the evidence right in front of them. Juries sent innocent men away. Every system built to catch a man like this, with all the resources a state can hand it, failed. And the only thing that never failed was a 13-year-old girl who fought back in her last moments and refused to let go. Today, there's no yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane anymore. But there is a place to remember 4 girls who were supposed to have decades ahead of them: Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy. Amy Ayers never got to grow up. She never got the horses, or the years, or the ordinary life a 13-year-old assumes is coming. But in the end, she did something almost no victim ever gets to do. From more than 3 decades away, she named him herself. One question still has no answer. Why was a man like Robert Brashers ever in Austin that night? If you have a theory, drop it in the comments. That's where cases like this stay alive. If this is how you believe the missing and the murdered deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Last Seen USA. Next time, we reopen another case. Subscribe so you're here when we do. Because Last Seen should never be the end of the story.